Welcome to our webinar on the key to context, which is about prompt engineering and knowledge engineering. I'm here with two of my longtime colleagues, Mike Doan and Sanjay Mehta. I'm going to let them introduce themselves in a moment. But I want to thank our sponsor, CMS Wire. They have been a great resource. And I also want to remind people that this book, The AI-Powered Enterprise, even though it was written 4 years ago, before the advent of large language models, when I first saw ChatGPT, I had an existential crisis. And I thought, is my work still relevant? And the more research I did, the more I realized it was more relevant than ever. And everything in this book is still valid today. So you can get a copy of that. I also wrote this article in the Journal of Applied Marketing Analytics. You've probably heard this before. What executives need to know about large language models, generative AI, and knowledge management. This connects the dots between what's in the book and what we're doing today with large language models and knowledge engineering. So that's my story. I've been in this business for over 25 years, close to 30 years, but who's counting? And it's just wonderful to see where we are at this inflection point in human history. And you guys are at the forefront of it, the audience. You folks are in the thick of this. So, you're going to be able to tell your kids and your grandchildren how you helped to usher this era in. And let me have my colleagues introduce themselves. Sanjay, do you want to provide a little bit of your background? I mean, we've known each other for over 20 years and back in the Endeca days, but go ahead and give a little thumbnail of what you've been up to and who you are.
Yeah, thanks, Seth. Happy to be here. But more of my background, and while it's relevant here, is coming from a kind of consumer side of this information engineering or knowledge engineering. When we think about kind of the consuming side, it's search, for example, applications, information retrieval types of applications, e-commerce, personalization, and again, as many of you might be seeing today, there's the AI is penetrating a lot of these spaces, even though it's been around in many ways, right, in the form of recommendations, for example, for e-commerce for a long time, and search, sort of the search natural language processing for a long time. But now we're definitely at a foray of a kind of new generation of what we're going to see happen with these models. And again, when I think about knowledge engineering and information architecture and how critical it is on the path of enabling AI and making it accurate, for example, and productive. This is, again, why I'm real happy to be working both with Seth and Mike on this webinar.
And Sanjay, you've spent a lot of time with the search vendors, with e-commerce vendors. Most recently, you were with Lucidworks, so you have very deep expertise. And one of the things that Sanjay is doing with us is building proof of value projects. So I'm going to talk about at the end of this, setting up a call with anybody who'd like to talk about your initiatives and how we can get to proof of value to show how to access your data very quickly through things like retrieval augmented generation, which is a big area. Mike, you and I also go way back, 20 plus years, I would say, something like that.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Hi, everybody. My name is Mike Doan, Director of Content Delivery, Cigna Healthcare within the Evernorth Health Services Group. And yes, Seth, we've gone back 25 plus years. Prior to my position, retired associate teaching professor, University of Washington Information School. So I spent a lot of years in academics, at the same time doing consulting work. And that's where Seth and I have known each other for a long time. So happy to be here, and certainly interested in sharing some things that we're working on right now at Cigna.
That's wonderful. Thank you, guys, both. Just housekeeping, we're going to be recording this, or we are recording this, so you can access it later, share it with your colleagues, have it as a nice video for date night with your significant other. Okay, that was kind of funny. We'll go about 50 minutes. I have a lot of material, so I'm going to try to keep on time. And we really want your input, especially the exit survey or the webinar survey. We're going to have polls throughout to get your thoughts, but we also want to get your thoughts after the webinar, especially if you want to get a briefing or you want to have a conversation or any of those things. There's going to be lots of questions. I don't want to go through this. This is early information science. We've been around for about 30 years. That's a long time. I hate to say that. Yeah, I started when I was 14. That's right. We work across industries, but it's always about making information more usable, more findable, more valuable. And what's interesting is our history around knowledge management, knowledge architecture, knowledge engineering is what's really critical now. There's a lot of new players to this space of large language models and generative AI who really don't understand the core principles or how to operationalize this at a global organization and do it across departments and across the organization in a way that's sustainable, right? We need to make sure these things are sustainable. We'll talk all about some of that stuff, and we have a lot of other materials to cover. Before we get started, I just want to understand, where are you in your journey? So is it not on the radar? I hope it's on the radar. Planning stages, controlled experiments, banned, right? Some people cannot use this at all. Yeah, implemented POCs or POVs, I like to call them proof of value. You've deployed them, or none of the above. So it looks like some people say it's not on the radar, which is very interesting. A lot of planning. I see the popcorn popping whenever I do these things. I kind of watch how people are responding. And when it starts slowing down, I know the popcorn is starting to burn, meaning their brains are kind of overloaded with that. So you know how it is, right? You hear it going in the microwave. And let's see. So let's see. Not on the radar. There's none of the above. Let us know in chat. There's a couple of people that said none of the above. So I'd like to understand that. So let us know in chat. And let's see, we're sharing the results. Let me share the results now. Whoops. Oh, we are sharing the results. Thank you, Carolyn. Carolyn behind the scenes doing her operational magic, which is always wonderful. So we see that there are some people that don't have it on the radar, which is interesting, but that's okay. These things need to take time to percolate. I like to say the market changes faster than the organization's ability to absorb change. It's very true with all sorts of technologies. Planning, a lot of people planning, a lot of people doing experiments, some banned, understood, right? That's an important consideration, because there's copyright issues, there's IP issues, and so on, internally or externally facing POCs, and some have deployed, which is wonderful. Any commentary on this? This is kind of an expected distribution, but Mike or Sanjay, do you have any thoughts on what you're seeing here? Is this surprising, or is this what you would expect to see at this stage in the market?
It aligns with what my understanding is.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go ahead and keep going then. So we're going to talk about the fact that there is no AI without IA. You do need to have information architecture. I coined that phrase many years ago, back in 2016, actually. Oh, chat is disabled. Okay, so do it in question. If chat's disabled, I'm sorry about that, but do it in the Q&A tab if you want to answer other or something like that, if you're none of the above. And of course, ask questions. So I wrote this article many years ago, 2016, a little bit of an industry catchphrase, but it's basically saying that we have to have, that there's assumptions that are made, right? If you're not doing your information architecture, somebody else did it. And that article was recently published or reposted to LinkedIn, where someone said it's more valid today than it was in 2016. So it is more important today. And again, it's the criticality of understanding that knowledge and that content and that data and structuring it in a way. We're going to talk about knowledge engineering. And we're going to get into taxonomies, ontologies, knowledge graphs. We'll talk about how those knowledge graphs and ontologies are related to large language models, and considering how we need to think about metadata. Metadata is still very important. In fact, I say it's more important than ever because you can't get the right context without metadata. And the reason a lot of Gen AI projects are failing is that they don't have the right structured information, and people have unrealistic expectations as to how they work and what they can do. We're going to talk about prompts, right? So we have, on the one hand, we have a knowledge architecture, which says we need to have the knowledge available for our LLM. Normally, an LLM is trained with information and understands relationships of terms and concepts. So that is kind of inherent in the model, but it doesn't know your world, doesn't know your IP. So we need to say, how do we connect that? And then we have prompts, Prompts are the questions we ask, and prompts are actually containers for metadata. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the role of use cases and how we can build standardization, and then we'll give you some ideas for next steps. So I'm going to open this up to just general discussion. And Mike, what are your thoughts about knowledge engineering, and how do you define it, and just kind of walk through your thinking around taxonomy and ontologies and so on?
Yeah, that's good. So no AI without IA. To me, this is the IA part, where we are building, borrowing, reusing, repurposing taxonomies from a number of different sources. Taxonomies are foundational because they are the language model that you are building. And later, we talk about how we're working at Cigna. We've got some groups working on this, of course, and my group is working on the linguistic modeling, and then other groups are working on the analytic modeling with regard to knowledge graphs. But foundationally, taxonomies define the language. And regardless of what you're trying to do, you've got to have a foundational language that is established within an enterprise. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of cross chatter with regard to this means this doesn't mean that, and word definitions. And so taxonomy sets that up. The taxonomy is the foundational linguistic model that you need to create to reflect, organize, characterize the language that you use within your enterprise. Every enterprise has a lot of overlap with other enterprises. Of course, you're going to have a standard language. We're in healthcare. There's standard taxonomies for healthcare. At the same time, there's language that we use that perhaps others don't use. And this is where taxonomy comes into play. It's still a hierarchical organization. It's still done the traditional way that's been around for hundreds of years. But the idea is that you're modeling your language as a basis, as a foundation, as an architecture for how you move forward with knowledge engineering. The ontology part of it is just the next step. So once you've got your taxonomy in place, the ontology really is just a way in which you create the relationships, named human-based relationships between the terms you've got in your taxonomy. And we've done that. We're working on that right now. We've been working on it since I came on board at Cigna, and it's a continuing, evolving process. Taxonomies are never done. Therefore, ontologies are never done. They are useful at every stage. It's just that as we're learning more about how terms are related semantically to one another, and by that I mean the meaning, how does one term relate in a meaningful way to another term? That's how, to me, ontologies are relational. Yes, we're creating triples. Yes, we're doing the subject, predicate, object. We're doing the typical scenarios in our ontologies that do that. Where we're at right now is that we've got a pretty extensive ontology built. But what we're now waiting for is the moment, and this is probably going to be discussed later, the moment where an AI system can help us generate predicates, can generate the relationships between terms based on what we've already modeled, in addition to what insights that a generative AI system can provide. So that's where we're going next. A lot of other companies are wanting to do that as well. There is really no way, in my opinion, to sustain any kind of ontological modeling with humans. There's just too much demand, and there's not enough resources out there to do it, or time. So we're looking at ways in which we can auto-generate the relationships, meaningful relationships that humans understand between one or more terms. The integration to content management is critical because, as we're doing, as others are doing, being able to integrate your taxonomy ontology into a content management system, headless or otherwise, is important, because as your content is being tagged up in that content management system, one way or another, either through auto classification or maybe even through manually doing it, it's that metadata, that the metadata contained in those tags that links all this together. So we could have a very robust taxonomy or a brilliant ontology, but where then do you apply it? I mean, part of the knowledge engineering part of it is figuring out ways in which you can improve not only the quality of your content, but the way in which your content is related to another piece of content, and how you can start to explore ways that these previously siloed content lakes, bays, rivers, whatever you want to call them, and that in the past were blocked off from one another, how those can be joined together. And that's another part that we're experimenting with as well. Content management is critical because as you're creating new content every day, without metadata, being able to sort of, enclose and wrap that piece of content and make it more useful via the taxonomy, the terms of your taxonomy, and the relationships you built in your ontology, that content remains siloed. In addition, there's a lot of content that is already extant, that's in place, that needs to be retrofitted, if you will, retro tagged with some metadata so that it can then be useful as well. And so the content management system, super critical, because that's, to me, that's where the knowledge that you've engineered up to that point via the metadata, can come to fruition. Harvesting knowledge, that's a tough one. And there's a lot of different ways to do it. And there's ways that we've experimented with and I've experimented with in the past, including things like, something as silly as the transcripts from a Zoom interview like this being cleansed and put into a document so that an interview process of somebody who's retiring or leaving a company, for example, that knowledge can be harvested via an interview in Zoom, translated from closed captioning into text. Text document then gets tagged up based on the metadata that you've put into your system, and on and on. And there's a lot of different ways to do this. We were even experimenting with ways in which we'd have readers go through and read closed captioning, extract text, pop that in, and then go search to, I don't know what's called, bookmarks or some points in the middle of a video that you can jump to where it talks about, the query that you provided. So all of that, again, foundational to starting with taxonomies and then moving on to more advanced ways in which you can use that language. The last one, then I'll pause and we can ask some questions or you can throw in some ideas, is that subject matter experts are critical to this day. I mean, many of us were and are attending the Semantic Layer Summit, what's going on right now. And folks like Juan Cicada are talking about, the human in the loop kind of thing. But subject matter experts are very critical to this because as we, as information scientists, go out and build taxonomies and ontologies, we're not doctors, we're not clinicians, we're not medical experts. And part of it is going out and finding those subject matter experts to validate a taxonomy that you built, validate the relationships between terms inside of an ontology, fine-tuning the way in which one term relates to another term, and especially in insurance as well. We're not experts in those areas. So we've had to rely on subject matter experts to do a lot of validation, still doing that, but also to bring in new ideas, because there's areas, even though we've used standard taxonomies, we've used taxonomies that I've developed over the years, we've used other taxonomies that we've developed internally, it still needs work. And subject matter experts, for now, are invaluable. I think later I'm going to talk about integration of knowledge graphs into large language models, which to me is a very exciting thing. And again, as others have pointed out, enhancing a large language model with a knowledge graph is critical, but all of that comes back to this, which is starting with taxonomies that are rich and appropriate and validated, moving on to ontologies that really are expressive of the way humans speak, and then understanding that once you get all that knowledge harvested, applying it via metadata and a content management system validated by SMEs, all of that's critical. And we're doing all of that right now. And it's a large amount of work. However, the payoff in the end is going to be, we're imagining, great, because we can now use the power of an AI system and a large language model to enhance what we're doing. And I think that the timing is just perfect right now. I mean, Seth and others, and we've been working on this for a long, long time. And finally, it's come to a point where it's going to start being realized. And that's exciting.
Absolutely.
So I'll stop talking for a second.
Yeah, no, thank you, Mike. And that was a great overview. And for those of you who are less familiar with terms like taxonomies and ontologies, we're going to go into a little more depth about that. But I wanted to give you that kind of overarching frame of reference. And Sanjay, you've been working in this area for many years. You don't have to go through this bullet by bullet, but what are your, overarching thoughts about the whole knowledge engineering space, and then how critical that is these days? Because again, people have this misunderstanding about large language models, saying, well, I'm going to ask the LLM for this information. But really, what we want to do is use the large language model to interpret our question, and then use structured knowledge and data to be able to power the answers. So what are your kind of overarching thoughts here?
Yeah, I think a big one is really how's the taxonomy going to be used, right? It's sort of the sort of systems. Maybe search is a good one. I think we all are really familiar with, right? In general, and Google uses again, like a knowledge graph and taxonomy in your everyday, right, to understand your intent, to break down your queries, and again, even OpenAI model, and you think more of a kind of advanced conversational scenario, and how is it extracting that intent, and what topics and other areas of interest that you may have. I think is a kind of the big thing to think about is the use case of that, from the e-commerce, just to throw that hat on. For many of you guys might be in that space as well, thinking about your product information management, your PIM, your catalog structure, right? I think we all see elements of this when you think about the attributes, right, that are presented. And if I think about attributes, and another layer when we think about SMEs, what attributes are important based on who is consuming this, right? And how is it being used? And then finally, just a quick on the analytics and insight, and a lot of the input that goes into AI, including LLM, is thinking about incorporating taxonomy and the analytics side, right? So you have these events, and then marrying it to some of the underlying knowledge or taxonomy that it's touching, whether it's a piece of content or structured product data. Those are kind of the big areas. And finally, giving context to the LLM, right? Especially if this is internal taxonomy versus something external, using a lot of that to provide and generate a context when you're having implementations such as like a retrieval augmented generation.
Which we'll talk about shortly. And I just had a couple of comments here, and I want to address these as we go through this. But one of the questions from Rick Cantor is saying, well, how are companies dealing with the critical need to have carefully curated information, which is thoughtfully and strategically kept up to date, accurate, and relevant? So that is the billion-dollar question, right? Because a lot of what we're doing today with AI is to make up for our past sins in poor data hygiene and poor content hygiene and poor knowledge hygiene. This is a critical thing. And what we need to do is we need to make the punishment fit the crime, meaning we have to look at high-value content, high-value data, high-value information that supports a particular process. And then we can measure that. As Sanjay was talking about marrying this to analytics, we have to be able to look at behaviors and the impact on processes. So all of this has to be justified by some kind of improvement. I'm not sure what's dinging here, but maybe it's the Zoom is dinging. But it has to be tied to value, right? We can't do this stuff, and I'll show you. I think I have my usual slide, which is we call our metrics layer cake, but it shows that you have to think about the value of the process and how that information is going to drive that process. I used to say to people, when they'd say, oh, make search like Google. I said, if you put as much time and energy into your content as people do who want to optimize their e-commerce sites to have, top ranking in Google, yes, it would be like Google. So, when it drives commerce, people will put the energy into it. So this is where we need to look at internal processes and say, how are we going to drive that internal process, and how are we going to be instrumented for those internal processes so that we can show that value? I'll let you guys comment in just a moment, but the other comment here was, sounds like conceptual subject model in the data modeling world. Would you guys agree with that? Would you agree with that framework or that way of looking at it? I think so, because it's conceptual. It's like looking at what's important to the business and then building a data model around that. what we want to start with taxonomies or domain models, which are big picture organizing principles, product, services, customers, employees, documents, and regions, solutions, processes, whatever it might be. And then those are the big concepts. And then we start to build finer degrees of granularity, and the taxonomies become the vocabularies that represent those concepts. And then we have the relationships between those different concepts, which forms the ontology or the knowledge framework. Let's see. So Sanjay and Mike, did you want to comment on this, or did you want to let us, or do you want us to move along and then we'll comment as we go? But the whole critical idea here is dealing with that carefully curated information.
Yeah, there's the last one here on how is it used to train and fine tune. So I think think about when you're pointing or even creating your own model, using and pointing it against sort of all your corpus of content. The metadata is really valuable. For example, that you could get, for example, the labels that have already been created over from the ontology, right? Or your knowledge graph, and feeding that is a common way. And then obviously we'll talk a little bit about marrying that with sort of behavioral analytic data and how the data is used as another dimension. But that's usually the first use case we see is that the metadata that you get from it.
And
yeah, the first question, and I mean, I know it's a boring word, but governance is now more important than ever.
I was thinking, what's the most boring word we could come up with here? I'm sorry.
It is. I mean, honestly, it is. And it even bores me, and I love it. And it's still kind of boring. But it is critical that in order to get that value out, you've got to set some rules up and some, as Seth was saying, bumpers, guidelines, whatever you want to call it, so that folks are not just, once again, randomly creating silos of information that are not going to be used. And so we're finding more and more, and as my team is working on governance as well, that especially with content management systems, is that's what's critical. I'll leave it set at that. That could be another hour on
I
governance.
know. By the way, do you guys see when I put up the question and answer box, or does that not show up for you? You have you don't see it right now, right? On my screen? You do? Oh, okay. All right. I didn't know whether it was showed up or not. So my bad. Anyway, so let's keep going. So we're going to talk again about more about this relationship between knowledge engineering and content, and it really is about emulating judgment and behavior of expertise. And knowledge architecture are the design artifacts that lets us do that, to contextualize things. I actually had that a double asterisk as quoting myself, but then I thought that was kind of, I did it tongue in cheek, but then I took it out. But me, right? But the point here is that we're trying to define the information that's going to allow us to contextualize information, so that when people are looking for something, they can get exactly what they need when they need it. And this is the goal of personalization. This is the goal of contextualization, of knowledge management. It's the holy grail of knowledge management. And one of the things about artificial intelligence is they used to say in the 2000s that as soon as AI worked, it was co-opted by another field, so it was no longer called AI. And so by definition, AI never worked. So no AI, so nothing was AI. It was, if it was AI, it didn't work. And so now everything is AI. But back then, word processing was one of the first applications of AI, but we don't call it AI, we call it word processing, right? Or spell check or speech recognition, all of these things. So when we're trying to emulate judgment and behavior in some way, we're trying to capture what human judgment would be, and we're trying to emulate that in some way. And the knowledge architecture is taking that tacit knowledge, right, the things that people know, and making it explicit, writing it down, and allowing a system to be able to process that, so we can surface it back to users. And this is the idea of, if you were building a house, you don't just start digging holes and foundations and pouring foundations. You want to be able to design this, and you need an architecture. And just like with a house, we have lots of different types of architectures. We have foundation plan and framing plan and HVAC plan and plumbing and electrical plan and so on. And the same thing happens in knowledge engineering. We have lots of different things. We have metadata structures, we have taxonomies, we have ontologies, we have content models, we have, wireframes and renderings and, use cases and so on. So part of this is saying that we need to design our information house in order for it to serve our purposes, and understanding those purposes is where we define things like use cases. I want to ask this question now of the audience is, where are you on your knowledge management, right? Because again, we're saying that there's a critical link between knowledge management and, we'll talk again about things like retrieval augmented generation. Do you want to put that up? Thank you. So no formal programs, early stages, departmental, widely operationalized, none of the above. So we're seeing a pretty reasonable distribution here. A lot of folks without formal knowledge management, early stages. I mean, this is kind of where we expect things to be. And the challenge is, even though it's widely deployed and operationalized, there still are challenges, right? We still need to kind of, as Mike was alluding to, it's never done. Taxonomies are never done. Knowledge is never done. Like people say, when's the taxonomy going to be done? You say, as soon as we're done with sales and marketing and manufacturing, right? Because everything is in flux. You're always changing things. And that's why, as Mike said, you need that governance, which is the intentional way of making decisions. You're measuring results, right? You're getting feedback. You're making sure that you're getting the value from these things. And then you are evolving this. So let's see. So I've seen the popcorn has stopped popping. So I'm going to share the results here. I think Carolyn is anticipating, reading my mind, and she understands my user journey. So she's anticipating the next step and what my knowledge need will be, and that was to share the results. So, a lot of folks have no formal CAM programs, or they're at the early stages, departmental, and then love to hear the stories about things that are well operationalized. And again, if it's none of the above, maybe it doesn't apply to you. But let's see. Do you recommend global standards for taxonomies and ontologies like ISO, IEC, etc.? And thank you, Rick, for the positive feedback. And we're still going to talk more about how taxonomies and ontologies are used to fine-tune. It's fine-tuning the information. It's not necessarily fine-tuning the model itself. But we'll get into that distinction. So here's the thing about standards. The old saying is there's the nice thing about standards, there's so many to choose from, right? Take life sciences. My goodness, right? There are thousands and thousands of taxonomies and ontologies, and they, it's fitness to purpose, right? So you can use those standards to make sure that you're complete, but standardization is for efficiency, like data interchange. Differentiation is for competitive advantage. So when you think about your organization and interacting with other organizations, if you do what everybody else does, you'll get efficiencies, but you're not going to have a competitive advantage because you're doing what everybody else does. What you're doing with your differentiation, with your taxonomies and making them unique to your processes, is you're saying that my way of reaching the market, my solutions, my way of interacting with customers, my understanding of market positioning and messaging and all of that, that's unique to my organization. My processes are unique to my organization. Even though I'm in healthcare, they're still unique to the organization. Mike, do you want to speak about that? Because your area has lots and lots of standards. There's no shortage.
Right. That is true, Seth. And we pretty much did follow that pattern of starting with standards. But, like out of the hundreds and hundreds of these taxonomies I've built, you always have to deviate because your internal language, your enterprise language is going to vary slightly, which is fine, but you still have the standards, whether it's a term or a reference that's built in there that you can use because you want to do that. And one of the reasons you want to do that is for governance reasons. Another is for standards that you can show to folks internally that, because sometimes even today we still get this question of like, well, who made you the language chief? And I'm like, it has nothing to do with me. It has to do, here are the standards, and then here's what we're using internally. It's a combination of both. It's a hybrid
Yep.
that enables us to have our own proprietary reasons for doing it. What we're finding is that real value of that comes not necessarily in the taxonomy, but using standards for our ontology development, and then creating variants on that is where real value is. And that's what we're discovering as well. But yeah, we start with standards, you evolve as needed, and you come up with your own internal versions.
And it becomes an internal standardization process, right? So you have
Right.
the external standards, especially for data interchange, right?
Right.
We have healthcare portability, records portability, right? That is based on standards. And then we have internal processes. So we have to use those external standards in order to communicate with other organizations and to do data interchange. I like to say a supply chain is an information chain. It's a data chain. It's a chain of an information supply chain goes along with a physical supply chain, and that requires standards. But you still see that organizations have their unique way of presenting their information on a website. Just like if you go into two different grocery stores, they're going to have a whole different setup, right? They're not going to be exactly the same, even if they sell the same basic goods, right? So it's an important thing to keep in mind. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to enforce consistency within the organization. Taxonomy becomes a set of controlled vocabularies that are agreed upon in terms of meaning and application. And that becomes the internal standard so that you're not misaligned within the organization. So domain modeling is very important to get people on the same page, building taxonomies, building ontologies. And again, taxonomies are the individual. Oh, let me go ahead and just go through this animation real quick. So when we look at navigation versus classification, right? We're used to navigational hierarchies. That's like going into the store and seeing the different ways people put stuff on their shelves and their planograms. But we're not talking about that. That's what a lot of people think when they hear taxonomy. They think, of a navigational path. But really what we're talking about, those static hierarchies are really out. They're usually, it's a dated approach, for most sites. And what we're trying to do is drive these with classification hierarchies. Now, you do need to have your basic categories, but that should be dynamic based on the needs of the user or the segment, right? Because if you're going to a website that sells home goods or home like a Home Depot, and you're a painter versus you're a plumber, right? You're going to have different needs or different requirements. So you will have some ability to self-select your navigational approach. But again, we're trying to drive classification dynamically. We're not trying to do navigational, like sometimes people call them business taxonomies, but because there's no classification rules. I won't get into all my definitions of hierarchies and associative relationships and entry relationships, but the idea is true taxonomy is a relationship. It's a parent-child whole part relationship. But there are times when you divert from that standardization because you're using associative terms, which are more about the user experience. Like, where's an alarm clock? We used to have this problem at Best Buy. What's an alarm clock, right? Is an electronic device. I mean, who has alarm clocks anymore? But my cell phone, smartphones ate that category. But at the time, was it an electronic device, or was it something you associate with the bedroom, right? Because now, as a purely taxonomic view, it's a device, an electronic device, but from a user experience perspective, it was associated with the bedroom, right? So again, it's diverting from that pure is a relationship. Here's where we have a bunch of different taxonomies, right? A bunch of different hierarchies. These are used for classification. It allows for isness and aboutness. What is this thing? And then what can you tell me about it? So the idea is saying, I have a contract. I can hand this thing to somebody. It's a contract. But what kind of contract? And if I have 1,000 contracts, how do I tell them apart? That's the aboutness. It's a work order. It's an employment contract. It's a real estate contract. It's a loan contract, right? Those are the things that we define, and those become the attributes. And again, this is where we start defining the relationships between those different classification hierarchies, because we say, oh, okay, what are the interests of this customer role, right? What are the environments for this industry, right? What are the tasks for that role, right? That's where we start relating those things. So classification hierarchies, when we have the relationship between those different vocabularies, that's when we have ontologies. And ontologies, when we connect them to data, that gives us the knowledge graph. The knowledge graph is really the ontology is the knowledge scaffolding of the organization. And then when you use that to access data, that becomes a knowledge graph. Do you guys want to comment on that? Does that, do those definitions resonate, and are you in alignment with all that?
Yeah, I think, classification to me was always about, navigation is linear, one place to another, and classification is more modular in that it modularizes that piece of content, that tag, whatever it happens to be, that word, so it can be related to other things, exactly as you're shown here in these two maps. So yeah, the linearity of navigation is needed, but that's not where we're going with this. It's about those creating that modularity and being able to create those relationships on top of that.
Yes. Sanjay, do you want to add to that?
And I think it's also when it gets to like how that the graph is interpreted as well, based on the user, right? What whether it is navigation or even when they were looking at I think about commerce and a product, right? Again, what aspects of it are important based on what they're doing in that user, right? You hit on that again, and maybe the job they need to perform or the application, and even tying back to like a standard that you might incorporate, like a ISO standard, like safety, you might do that layer, right? Because if it's a product that's related to the use of the product is impacted by like the safety regulation, for example, right? So kind of incorporating that relationship, I think, is key.
Absolutely. So I think we want to clarify how we are using taxonomies and knowledge graphs. So again, here are the taxonomies. The taxonomies are the controlled vocabularies. They're the official terms that comprise these categories, like industrial distributors. I'm reading my other screen here because it's bigger. Departments, document types, products, customers. That's all taxonomy. And then when we have the relationships between those, right? So in this case, we have interest of a role in the middle there. You see, that's the ontology. We have, ABC company is the same as ABCO or ABC Co. That is what's called an entry or an equivalence relationship, which is kind of a synonym. It can be a synonym. It can also be an antonym. But anyway, departments are part of ABC company. Certain departments produce various products. Products are related to specific industries. In specific industries, their environments. And you can, anytime you come up with a relationship between two concepts, you can have it. One time I had IBM and it was software group and hardware. And there was people asking, is there a relationship there? And somebody said, software group blames hardware. So if you can come up with a relationship, you can have it. So then we're saying that as we add, when we use that ontology as an entry point to get to our data, when we overlay the data with the ontology, that is the knowledge graph. So does that make sense to folks? Is that, that's the relationship. I hope that was helpful. Sivarama, did that answer your question? And the other question here was saying, it's a long question. Data scientists and knowledge engineers were at symposiums, and the vendors were not doing KM as they understood it. Now he's jumping in. The question is, have you noticed the KM pros are reluctant to embrace the applications for their success? So there is a bit of a tendency to kind of hand curate a lot of stuff, right? There is a certain amount of human judgment that is required, and there's a certain amount of information that is a certain amount that can be derived, that can be extracted, and that is really what large language models are helping with. And you have tools to do things like auto categorization, but there's always a human judgment element of this stuff. Let's see, GQL. Do you want to talk about GQL? I'm not familiar with GQL. Sanjay or Mike, GQL?
Yeah, graph query language.
Oh, of course, graph query language. Yes,
yeah, and so that there's and so that I think is
like Cypher and
right, yeah, like the Neo4j, a bunch of platforms.
Neo4j, yep, absolutely.
And so again, that's a common one, and retrieving data.
Yep. Yep. Okay. Thank you. I was not making that connection at that moment. Okay. So GQL, yes. So graph query languages like Cypher and using those types of things to go in and access the information from the graph. Thank you for that observation. And a knowledge graph is much more than just nearest neighbor. Do you want to interpret that question, Sanjay? What do you think that Rick is getting at there?
Yeah, I mean, we think about like one use case is using vectors, or vector systems, right? And
Okay. Yep.
looking at building relationships
Oh,
between
yeah.
similarity scores, or like it's sort of the mathematical distance between two topics, for example. And so that is one tool, for example, that could help build these ontologies, for example, or even your knowledge graphs, and they can coexist. But I think that's definitely what we're talking about here goes way beyond just that sort of mathematical similarity score, right?
Yep.
That we're seeing in vector systems. There's so many other layers here to that.
Right. Right. And Cypher, again, being the language to be able to do a query against
Yeah, for
knowledge.
example, Neo4j supports that.
Yep. So they become let's talk about this. How do we integrate linguistics and analytics? And I am watching time. We have about 15 minutes, and we're answering questions as we're going. So that's great. When we think about knowledge graphs and LLMs, how are we thinking about analytics and linguistics? And to me, it's about how they're performing and really, when you think about ingesting this stuff into an LLM, that's a vector space. And that's a mathematical representation of knowledge. But then we also have the reference of a knowledge graph to say, well, here's the source of truth for the organization, right? Here's the data sources. And we have a mechanism to connect those different data sources based on those relationships. So do you want to talk a little bit more about this?
So,
Sanjay or Mike?
I can make one comment and then Sanjay can take over from here. But we're doing both linguistics and analytics with our knowledge graphs because we realize that that a knowledge graph, a linguistic knowledge graph model can enhance and make, how about this, an LLM smarter, faster, rather than having to go through a lot of iterative testing, because it is providing in-house corporate company enterprise knowledge and injecting that straight into an AI system's ability to interpret that. So I'm going to leave it there and let Sanjay go.
Yeah, and I'll just on the analytics piece, I think is something we've been doing in the search world for a long time, which is really using whether it's supervised, unsupervised types of signal data. Think about how folks are reacting, like click-throughs on a result, and what the sort of the journey has been after they interacted with a particular piece of information, right? And those are other pieces of layer where we then determine how to rank or prioritize content or information, and gives us extra context on like behaviors, and maybe even who's interacting with the data. So there's a tremendous, and then for now machine learning, tagging these analytics with some of this ontology or extra data is like rocket fuel, I believe.
Right. We just talked about that the other day in our other presentation about the analytics and the ability to semantically tag the analytics results. But yes, it is about understanding the behavior. And we look at that user journey. We want metrics for each stage of that journey. And then we want to be able to understand how we're impacting a particular process. So, when we look at generative AI, many folks know this, it's creating new content, not a copy of the data, and it's creating it based on those learned patterns of knowledge and information. So this means we need to reference that by the technology. And we've already been talking about this, making sure that our bots have the knowledge that is needed to answer the question officially, right? So it doesn't hallucinate. We need to make sure they understand what those sources are, and we need to understand and design the knowledge base so it can support those user needs. Because again, if one of the things we can do with retrieval augmented generation is be able to, and I'm just going to move forward here because we talked a little bit about that already. But when we look at retrieval augmented generation, we can actually use the knowledge graph knowledge. The LLM understanding of the world to answer the question, right? But it can hallucinate. It'll make things up because It's a stochastic parrot. It's actually repeating things. It's giving you a statistical likelihood of the words that are coming next. And so that's not always necessarily reality, right? That's when I first asked ChatGPT about myself. It gave me a bunch of degrees and PhD and all these books that I'd written and all these teaching positions and so on. But we can also use it to retrieve the information based on the organization. So we can say, give me that corporate information source. And we still use the LLM to process the query and to understand it. And then we use that to retrieve the information. And again, that's where we can use the knowledge graph to be that reference and that source of truth. So what we're doing is we're saying we need to understand what that query is, and then we need to process the result so that we can make it more conversational. But then what we're doing is we're using the knowledge as the ground truth in the organization, the corporate information. So that's processing the query, it's processing the results, but it's using your corporate data. This is called retrieval augmented generation. And when we think about doing this, now we have to start thinking about what is context, right? When we think about how people find information, a lot of times, you might say, oh, here's a manual. Well, guess what? RTFM, read the friggin' manual. TLDR, too long, didn't read. Or you could say, look in chapter 4, but have you ever looked in chapter 4? There's tons of irrelevant stuff. You could also say in chapter 4, here's the specific answer. Or you can say, here's the answer from chapter 4 based on your information and your particular context. Well, what is the user's context? It is based on their identity. It's whether it's an employee or a customer, we describe it with metadata, right? The isness and aboutness of an individual, just like we have the isness and aboutness of a piece of content. And what this does is it provides signals, right? We get this by understanding that journey and collecting signals throughout that journey, and then using that to influence where we go in that vector space when we're trying to get the answer. So this is super important in terms of being able to do this. Do you want to talk a little bit about this, Sanjay and Mike? And again, we're running a little low on time, but what are your thoughts about metadata? I say explicit and implicit, but it's really slow moving and fast moving. But you want to talk a little bit about this idea of metadata of the user?
Yeah, no, I think it's important when you're collecting interactions, whether they're internal users or external users, to really collect as much metadata as possible. I know there's a lot of privacy, regulations out there, but getting around, some of this is at a minimum of trying to get as much context as you can. Simple ones like, where are they asking the question from? What is their role? What's the sort of underlying circumstances, right? Those sorts of things I think are really important to collect as part of this, to understand their context, and then marrying those sort of positive interactions, right? What was the actual successful outcome that you saw, right? Thinking about like what result did they click on? If you look at the way Google does it, right? Like did they click on the 10th result, did they page, and then and scoring kind of the behavior of your audience, right? And using that, I think is very important as well. And I think there's a question even around like, there's a wide variation around user queries and those sorts of things. You can use these LLMs to actually help analyze your queries, right? They're like insane at NLP, as we all know, right? And having it analyze your query and then route basically the way the response is handled, I think is like a big one here too to think about, right?
And I think that, even like looking at the user's level of technical proficiency or what equipment they've owned, I mean, when you say, how do I set up my modem or where's the installation guide? An LLM can't answer that question without reference. This is where we start to build component architecture. And we say, if you said this to a support person, they'd say, okay, what modem do you have? Which model? 2960. Okay. Here are the installation settings. I'm getting an error code of 50. All right, here are the steps. So that context, that's all the context that we need. We need to have this on the content. The content needs to be tagged with this stuff, right? Because if we don't have that context on the content, then we can't answer that question. But then we could say, I need to install a model 2960 modem, but I'm receiving an error code 50. Please provide the troubleshooting steps. Now the prompt has all that metadata, right? It has that context. It has everything that I need. So one of the things that we want to do is we want to build use cases. And I'm sorry it took me so long to get this because I know we lost a few people here, but and we're just in the last few minutes of the webinar. But the whole idea here is that the use case provides the information for a prompt, right? Role metadata, who they are, level of technical proficiency, what their objective is, and the entity metadata. What are they trying to accomplish? And so when we start building these libraries, what this does is it helps us identify, they're good for testing functionality. We need a baseline source of truth, but they're also used for identifying the elements, right? So we need to have reference prompts that represent classes of use cases. We need to have training material for users to ask questions. We need to have that knowledge architecture that helps people provide clues as to how questions get the right context. And again, this is analogous to facet retrieval. An ambiguous question requires disambiguation. So what we're trying to do is say, how do we make these prompts more meaningful? And when we have things like one-shot prompts, that is not providing context, right? That's simply saying, summarize this text, give me the sentiment analysis, classify the spam. But few shot is starting to provide the more of the metadata around the task itself. It's saying, here's additional context. You are, the role of the customer, technical versus business, the role of the bot, right? That gets us closer in vector space. I'm going to go through this and say, and again, probably need a complete session on just prompt. I think we got really hung up in the knowledge engineering, but again, we need to understand the purpose of the prompt. We need to understand, what the target audience is. We need to be able to understand the context and the output. And again, these are all metadata, right? This is metadata about the content, about the output, about the audience, about the artifact, and other features that we can provide. Again, we're pretty short on time here, but I know these are some pretty good things. We'll do another session on this to kind of be the part B here. But do you want to speak to any of this quickly, Sanjay? I know we're kind of running out of time.
Yeah, I will, but definitely merits its own session. But around how we marry the sort of the entire like knowledge engineering we've talked about into, for example, a use case of prompt engineering, right? And so grabbing these areas of roles and HR hierarchies and all this sort of information about those users, whether they're customers or internal, and bringing that in and things like that, giving it examples, right? Providing hints and chain of thought. These are things you might hear. And again, it definitely a whole session just on this, but basically what we're getting here is how do we bring all this inform them into prompts that improve sort of performance of your LLM results.
Yeah, and I know we have a couple other questions that we're not able to get to, but we are going to answer those separately. Do you want to speak to this slide? I know there's a lot of content on here.
Yeah, here's kind of a reference for using kind of like an LLM to build more of a recommending engine, right? And an example of what a prompt template is, something you'll hear around what aspects of the prompt can be dynamic and fed from your system, right? Like your knowledge management system, again, giving some examples, right? And how you want the results to be presented may vary based on who's consuming the result, right? It could be actually another system, it could be another model consuming the output, and there's a bunch here. And again, monitoring it, auditing it, sort of observing it. There's a lot of that in this sort of example. And I know we're going to be sharing this slide, but we reference a paper we thought would be pretty valuable to kind of show how this would work, or a scenario in real world.
That's great. And you know what? Let's do this last poll if we can get people to answer this, and then we're going to have to wrap up. But I just want to make sure I understand if people see the connection between retrieval augmented generation. And I know we're losing people by the minute because we're right at the top of the hour. Forget leadership. It's not done at any level. Pockets of understanding, actively integrated. That's great. Thank you for these responses. Looks like there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And of course, there's a none of the above. I do apologize that we spent most of the session on the knowledge engineering. but I think that was very important. People had a lot of good questions on that, and it's so critical. And I think when you talk about knowledge engineering and prompt engineering, the knowledge engineering is critical, and it does align with the prompt engineering, which we started to show. But we will spend more time on that. So let's go ahead and end that poll and share the results. Sorry, Carolyn was stepping on each other. So again, pockets of understanding. Here's the thing. What we can do is, this is next steps. You know, you got to make sure you have funding for this stuff. But I want to just point out that we are doing, we're going to get these slides, but we are doing CAM proof of value projects. And you can take a look at this. It's a readiness evaluation. We can show you how to do this with your data, right? We can take your data and build a POV. And so take a look at that. We can do working sessions with you, get everybody on the same page, help them understand this stuff. Obviously, it's hard to cover everything in an hour, although we tried, but these are the things that you get with that. So, and then, you know, you can download this article that I mentioned, the AMA article. Oops, I think or you can get a physical reprint. And then by all means, reach out, connect on LinkedIn. Thank you very much for your time today. Thank you, Sanjay and Mike. I really appreciate your time and your thoughts. And apologies that I did not get to answer all of your questions. You will get the slides, but we will also record. We'll do a paper or write those questions up and do a white paper on that. And we'll do another session on prompt engineering. So thanks everybody. Thank you for listening, Mike and Sanjay and Carolyn. All that work behind the scenes. I appreciate it, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.